Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Purdy. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Briscoe Center, and I'm thrilled that you are here with us this evening. We are in for an absolute treat. We're here to celebrate Lawrence Schiller, and I'm proud to say that in addition to his many other accomplishments, he's a member of our Ambassadors Council. Our council is a group of dedicated friends who help us collect and preserve the evidence of history. And we have two other members of the council with us here this evening, Charles Porter and Ronnie Volkening. If y'all could raise your hands to be recognized. Thank you for everything that you do on our behalf. So as you can see from the slides that have been running, Larry Schiller's remarkable career has touched on some of the most significant events of the 20th century. And we're here to learn more about his work and his archive, which will soon be part of the Briscoe Center's collections. Larry's work touches on key themes in American history, moments of political change and upheaval, celebrity and popular culture, and crime and punishment. Themes that seem particularly appropriate this week. Tonight, our executive director, Don Carleton, will give us an overview of Schiller's career, followed by a conversation between Don and Larry. And so let me give a short introduction about Don Carleton. Dr. Carleton is the founding executive director of the Briscoe Center, and he's the author of 14 books, including Red Scare, Conversations with Cronkite, The Governor and the Colonel, a dual biography of William Hobby and Evita Culp Hobby. And most recently, he was my co-author, or I should say I was his co-author, for a new biography of former Texas newspaper publisher and Lieutenant Governor Bill Hobby. Don served as chief researcher and historical advisor for former CBS newsman and anchor Walter Cronkite's best-selling memoir, A Reporter's Life, and Cronkite's television miniseries, Cronkite Remembers. From 1998 until 2001, he conducted a series of oral history interviews with key figures in television history, including David Brinkley, Andy Rooney, Ed Bradley, Barbara Walters, Dan Rather, and Jim Lehrer for the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, all of which are available on YouTube. In 2015, the Texas Democracy Foundation honored Don with its Bernard Rappaport Award. Please join me in welcoming Don Carleton to the podium.
Well, thank you, Erin. Gosh, I learned a lot with that. Thank you. I appreciate the introduction. I really do. So, welcome to all of you here. I am delighted to see you, including our special guests, which include, of course, Lawrence Schiller, whose extensive and historically valuable collection will soon find a permanent home at the Briscoe Center. In a few minutes, Larry and I will discuss his archive as we view a selection of items from the collection. As you can see, we're showing a larger selection of images from the collection as I speak. It's a massive collection. In addition, during the reception after this program, we'll provide you, the members of our audience, with a copy of a book featuring some of Larry's most famous photographs. Larry has generously agreed to sign those books for you during the reception. But first, before we do any of this, I want to tell you about Larry Schiller. My introduction of Larry will necessarily be a bit longer than most introductions, mainly because his career has been so prolific, and despite his great professional success, he has not become a so-called celebrity. He's one of these guys that's always there, but kind of behind the scenes, and you see his photographs and you recognize them, but you may not know Larry. So, and also want to explain why, as a historian, I'm so enthusiastic and pleased that his life's work will be preserved here at the Briscoe Center and made available for research and teaching. Larry Schiller's long career has included work in a variety of media. He's been an award-winning photojournalist, book author, key collaborator of Pulitzer Prize winner Norman Mailer, skilled interviewer and researcher, an award-winning movie and television director and producer. And he has also been a book creator and packager, an exhibit producer and curator, and a director of major photographic scanning and database projects, among other endeavors. There's more. We only have so much time, however. Larry grew up in San Diego, California. After attending Pepperdine College, he worked through the 1960s as a freelance photographer whose work was published in many of the most popular publications of the time, including Life, Paris Match, the London Sunday Times, Time, Newsweek, and the Saturday Evening Post, just as a small group. Looking back at his career as a photojournalist, Larry has written the following, quote, "At the start of the turbulent 60s, I was only 23, but I had been a professional photographer for about a third of my life. It was the dawn of the golden age of photojournalism, and everything was moving past my camera awfully fast," unquote. So he also added, "Whenever a headline-making news event occurred, I was there. By the end of the 60s, I had covered so many stories, my photographs were becoming part of American history, which is, of course, why we're here today." That's music to my ears. As a photojournalist, Larry photographed a wide range of stories. He shot way too many notable photographs to mention in the time that we have tonight, but some of the most notable pictures that he took include his 700 photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald in the chaos at the Dallas Police Headquarters in the days immediately following JFK's assassination. Larry was also among the first in the media in the 1960s to pay close attention to the drug LSD by conducting a photo documentary on the subject for a magazine, which he also then published as his first book, titled LSD. But perhaps Larry's best-known work during this period of his career are his pictures of Marilyn Monroe, who he first photographed in 1960 on the set of Let's Make Love, and then again in 1962 when he photographed Monroe on the set of the last film she would ever work on, the unfinished Something's Got to Give. Those photos would later illustrate Larry's good friend Norman Mailer's book, Marilyn. After the 1960s, Larry made a career shift to become a movie producer and director and book publisher and researcher and interviewer. One of Larry's first forays into the film business was in 1968 when he directed a key 5-minute portion of the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And more about that in a few minutes from Larry. Now, in 1971, Larry produced and directed his cinema verite documentary, The American Dreamer, which was about the actor Dennis Hopper, which Larry shot on location in Taos, New Mexico. That film has become something of a cult movie now and is shown on a lot of college campuses. In 1974, he collaborated with author Albert Goldman on the bestseller Ladies and Gentlemen, Lenny Bruce. Larry's interviews and research for that book served as the basis for 1974's Oscar-nominated movie Lenny, which was directed by Bob Fosse and starred Dustin Hoffman. His movie work in 1974 also included the Oscar-winning The Man Who Skied Down Everest, for which he served as editorial director. In 1976, Larry published the widely celebrated Minamata, A Warning to the World, which featured famed documentary photographer W. Eugene Smith's photographs of the horrific birth defects resulting from mercury pollution in the seas around the Japanese city Minamata. In the late 1970s, Larry was Norman Mailer's key collaborator for the New York Times bestseller, The Executioner's Song. That particular book was about Utah murderer Gary Gilmore and Gilmore's successful legal effort to force the state of Utah to execute him. Larry also produced and directed 1982's widely celebrated made-for-television movie based on that same book, starring Tommy Lee Jones, who won an Emmy for his role as Gary Gilmore, and Rosanna Arquette, who played his girlfriend. He and I will discuss that experience in a few minutes. Mailer's biography, Norman Mailer's biographer, J. Michael Lennon, noted that Norman Mailer needed Larry Schiller's organizational abilities, his bottomless energy, and his deal-making chutzpah. Mailer called Larry, quote, one of the greater wheeler-dealers of all time. The Executioner's song would never have been nearly as good as it is, and this is again the biographer of Norman Mailer, anyway, would not be as good as it is if it hadn't have been for Larry's skill in interviewing, unquote. Larry has also produced and directed 6 other motion pictures and miniseries for television, including 1985's Peter the Great, which won 5 Emmys. Following the June 1994 stabbing deaths of O.J. Simpson's former wife, Nicole, and her friend, Ron Goldman, Larry gained the trust of O.J. Simpson, who was charged with both murders. That trust gave Larry exclusive access to Simpson and his legal team, which allowed Larry to assemble a definitive collection documenting one of the most sensational trials of the 1990s. Following Simpson's acquittal on murder charges, Schiller and journalist Jim Wheelworth co-wrote the book American Tragedy, the uncensored story of the Simpson defense, which is considered to be one of the very best books about that sensational case. In 1995, Larry was once again Norman Mailer's collaborator, in this case on Mailer's book Oswald's Tale, a detailed biography of Lee Harvey Oswald. He and I will discuss his experience with the Simpson murder trial and his work with Oswald's Tale in a few minutes. Larry has authored several other best-selling books, including American Tragedy, but also Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. The latter book is an in-depth study of the Jean-Benet Ramsey murder case in Colorado in 1996. And that book was the basis of a subsequent television miniseries that Larry directed. Larry's varied projects have also included serving as a producer and curator for several major exhibits, including one about Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. for the New York Historical Society. Larry also managed the 2020 centennial celebration of science fiction author Ray Bradbury, which included a magnificent book composed of the text of The Illustrated Man, Bradbury's collection of 18 short stories, and Larry's photographs of men and women with whole body tattoos. There is so much more that Larry has accomplished, but our time is short, so let me tell you about the Briscoe Center's Schiller collection. Larry's photojournalism archive, spanning the years 1956 through 1976, 20 years, includes more than 2,000 rolls of black and white film, more than 800 color slides, and 2,000 prints. It also includes a tape recording archive containing more than 720 hours of interviews with more than 150 people, including over 200 hours of interviews with Marina Oswald and those who knew or shadowed Lee Harvey Oswald while he lived in the Soviet Union. It also includes Larry's recorded interviews with Lenny Bruce's wife, Honey, and others involved in the life of Lenny Bruce, which served as the basis for the movie Lenny. And also a 10-minute recording made by O.J. Simpson on June the 17th, 1994, acknowledging his involvement in his wife's death. The recording was found in attorney Robert Kardashian's home after the Simpsons trial. In addition, the archive includes 50 hours of Larry's interviews with O.J. Simpson. These are all in the archive. They're coming to the center. Addressing Larry's skills as an interviewer, writer David Eggers has written that in doing research for The Executioner's Song, Larry meticulously interviewed Gary Gilmore, his girlfriend, Nicole, and nearly everyone else involved in that murder and execution story. Eggers wrote that, quote, Larry Schiller gained a novelistic level of detail that was unprecedented and has yet to be matched in the history of American journalism, unquote. The Schiller collection also includes an extensive archive of manuscript letters, documents, and legal records, including more than 200 pages of Utah murderer Gary Gilmore's handwritten correspondence with his girlfriend Nicole, as well as with Larry Schiller. Other material includes Norman Mailer's original manuscripts with handwritten edits for the books The Executioner's Song and Oswald's Tale. Also, 200 pages of Lee Harvey Oswald's KGB file with English translation, compiled by the secret police in the Soviet Union when Oswald lived there in Minsk, the Soviet Union. Also, Simpson's handwritten letter to the public from June 15th, 1994, which was read to the press by attorney Kardashian, and as well as the prosecution's 50 boxes of their discovery files in the case against Simpson, which were supplied to Simpson's defense team. Larry's entire archive fills several hundred boxes. My relationship with Larry began a few years ago when he contacted me to ask about our possible interest in getting the archive of photographer Jacques Lowe, who famously photographed JFK's campaign for the presidency in 1960 and the first few months of Kennedy's presidential administration. I traveled to Larry's then home in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where we arranged for the Lowe Archive to come to the Briscoe Center. The Lowe Archive is a visual treasure trove and an outstanding addition to our vast collection of the archives of photojournalists, which now we now have 10 million photographs in that archive. Larry followed that acquisition of the Jacques Lowe collection for the center by helping us acquire the archives of two other extremely important photographers. Photojournalist Lee Lockwood, best known for his work for Life, Newsweek, The Times of London, and many other magazines, and also especially his coverage of the civil rights and peace movements in the U.S., as well as communist leaders during the Cold War era, including, most prominently, Fidel Castro. Lockwood's archive was donated to the Briscoe Center by his widow, Joyce Lockwood, and that was also managed by Larry. And the second one, the archive of Austrian-American photojournalist, photographer, filmmaker, and poet, Liesl, I hope I'm pronouncing that, Liesl Steiner, who the New York Times described in her obituary, she recently died, as a flamboyant photojournalist who was celebrated for her intimate, emotive images of history-tilting figures like Fidel Castro, John F. Kennedy, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as well as luminaries of music, stage, and sports, unquote. Steiner's archive was donated to the Briscoe Center by Steiner's very close friend, Ingrid Rockefeller, who is with us tonight. I want to thank Ingrid for her generosity in making it possible for us to have the Steiner collection. Thank you. Be recognized, please. We want to thank you. So as you can tell, Larry Schiller has been and continues to be an invaluable supporter of the Briscoe Center, including serving as a member, as Aaron said, of the Briscoe Center's Ambassadors Council. And he's constantly searching for research archives to add to our collections. Don't stop, Larry, please don't. Larry now resides in Sherman Oaks, California, with his wife, Nina Weiner, who is the editor-in-chief, pardon me? Weiner, thank you. Weiner, okay, I'm stand corrected, thank you. She is the editor-in-chief of the Mayo Clinic Press, and prior to her current job, Nina was the celebrated editor for Taschen Books. Nina, please stand and be recognized. Thank you. I also want to recognize Colin McCarthy, Larry's archivist and chief of staff, whose skilled work has been invaluable to me and my staff in our work with the archive and in preparing for tonight's event. Thank you, Colin. I appreciate everything you do. And please now welcome Larry Schiller.
Thank you, Don.
There you go. Pull that the way you want to there.
That's all right.
Okay. Well, my goodness, Larry.
Woo! Well, I made it up today. I got up again. You know?
Oh my gosh, I don't know how, the comment about your energy being endless, I mean, my God, I don't know if you ever took a break during any of those years or not, but.
Well, you see, it all started when I was actually 15 years old, but when I was 12, my father gave me a camera as a bar mitzvah present. And he said to me one day, he said, if you could earn enough money with this camera to pay for half of a car, I'll pay for the other half. So my motivation at age 13 or 14 was that when I was 16 in San Diego, I'd be able to drive a car, so I had to earn enough money. And I'm highly dyslexic. The word didn't exist when I grew up in San Diego. My mother used to say to me, well, you just don't have the right teachers in grammar school, but you'll be able to spell and to read. I still can't. First Microsoft Word saved my life, and now, Alexa, how do you spell this word? So we didn't know at that time, but science has now said that people with dyslexia tend to move towards the arts somewhat. And so with my camera, my father was a salesman, a merchant behind the counter. I started to ride my bicycle, and I'd photograph skid marks of accidents that were near my house in Pacific Beach. And I realized that skid marks told a story, but I didn't realize what was really happening as I was learning about light. Overcast light, bright sunlight, cross lighting, backlighting. You can't move a skid mark around so it's the right light, so you have to learn how to use light, and that's what I was learning at this very young age. But then I had to earn enough money to get a car when I was 16, so I started selling the photographs to insurance companies because they tell the story of an accident, skid marks. And that's my background. And after that, that was my early motivation.
Well, and then, the rest is history, as they say.
That's right, yeah.
What I think we want to do, I mean, first again, let me thank you for
Oh, my
everything you've done
pleasure.
for us.
Yeah.
But I also what I want to do is I've selected a few images. You've all seen the photographs,
Yeah.
images. But I've selected a few that I'd like to talk
Sure,
about.
of
That I'd
course.
like for you to talk about. Now, this one here, for example, is obviously a young you.
Yes.
You're looking one way, I'm looking the other.
Right.
Yeah, but this is a young you to the left, and of course, everybody knows the person in the middle.
Right.
So what's going on here with you and Marilyn?
Well, in 1960, Look magazine wanted me to photograph Marilyn Monroe. I was already working from about the age of 17 when I went to college for magazines. And I was offered a lot of staff positions, but I had read an article about intellectual property rights. And the magazines wanted to own what you shot because you were work for hire. So I never accepted a position to work on staff or contract, but I would have contracts. So Look magazine in 60 asked me to photograph Marilyn Monroe. And I photographed her a couple days with Yves Montand. And in 62, I was doing a lot of work for a French magazine called Paris Match, the Life magazine of Europe. And Monroe was having a very difficult time. She had been run over by a lot of trucks in her life, as the saying goes. And they wanted me to photograph her at this crucial time, and she was making a movie at 20th Century Fox.
Larry, was this one in 60?
This is 62.
Okay, so now you're talking
Yeah,
about
62.
Evan, if you could put the next one on, that'd
Yeah.
be great.
And the short and long of it is, when you photograph a celebrity in those days, and this is kind of important, and you're not going to be on the set every day for 6 months or 2 months as long as the film is being made. So you usually sit down with the celebrity and you go through the script. Which scenes do you think are good? So I was in Marilyn's home with Pat Newcomb, her press agent, going through the script of Something's Got to Give. And Marilyn says, well, this scene where I jump in the swimming pool with the nude bathing suit on, and Dean Martin's on the balcony and he's watching me. She says, Larry, what would happen if I jumped in the swimming pool with that bathing suit on, but I came out with nothing on? And I said, Marilyn, you have really a big problem in your life now. You've got others, but you really got a big one. She says, what's the big problem about doing that? I can wipe Liz Taylor off the pages of all the covers, Richard Burton included. I said, the problem is you're already famous. Now you're going to make me famous. and she looked at me and said, don't be so cocky, Larry. I can fire you in 2 seconds. I said, you can't, because I already got Life magazine and Paris Match and Der Stern waiting. So she jumped in the swimming pool, and I had this indication that she would come out on that day with nothing on. And the famous photographer, Davis Douglas Duncan,
Right.
had given me years earlier a gift of an East German 180 millimeter sonar f2 lens that I had on my Nikon. And I knew Marilyn was a highly skilled professional woman. Put aside the public image, and the voice and all of that. And I knew that she wanted those pictures in the magazines all over the world. And that the key moments would not be when George Cukor was directing and the cameras were rolling, but it would be in between takes when they're setting up for the next setup. And I knew that's when my 180 millimeter sonar would come in handy. And there was another photographer on the set, Billy Woodfield. So these pictures are really Marilyn knowing what she's going to do, knowing the long-term effect of the pictures. And there's, you could talk for hours about what happened and everything, but the short and long of it is, it brought a certain notoriety to me because it opened the doors to more publications all over the world. And of course, the pictures appeared on the cover of Life, Paris Match, Stern, every place. And Hefner which is in my archives. Now, actually, my daughter has that letter.
Oh,
I got to
we
get
can
that.
wait
Right.
later.
Hugh Hefner writes me a letter when he sees it in Life and says, can't you get Marilyn to pose and do this, 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 and I'll guarantee the front cover and back cover. And tragically, the morning of her untimely death, I was at her house discussing with her Hefner's letter. And
Was she in the garden or something?
yeah, she had pinstripes and she was working on the garden in
Yeah.
that in the morning. And, and I went to Palm Springs that evening. And tragically, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, I received a phone call saying that she had been found unconscious and had passed.
How was she acting that was the very day she died?
Yeah, she was just, Marilyn, she'd get upset if I'd say something that dealt primarily with her body and not, she was really an incredible actress. I mean, you could see her turn it on and off as a light switch. The wiggle and the looking over the shoulder with her dossier pointing in the opposite direction, that was all Marilyn. She knew exactly, at that point in her life, she had perfected her public image. But she was one of the many celebrities. I mean, Paul Newman is instrumental with completely changing my life.
Well, we'll come back to that.
Yeah,
We'll come
yeah,
back.
yeah.
Okay, let's look at the next slide.
Yeah.
This is Larry in the middle here with the camera, and that's, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald.
So,
So tell them what's going on.
Interesting story here. I'm in Encino in the morning taking a shower, and my wife at that time, who since passed on, comes screaming into the bathroom. I just heard on the radio, Kennedy's been shot in Dallas. Kennedy's been shot in Dallas. And I opened the shower door and I ran out of the bathroom. I didn't wipe off or anything. I grabbed my camera bag, threw on some clothes, got in the car.
You did put some clothes on.
Yeah, I did.
All right.
And got in the car and raced to LAX airport. And I didn't realize at that time that LA was the closest media hub to Dallas. San Francisco's further away, Chicago. Atlanta didn't exist with CNN in those days. And there is Dick Stolley with Life magazine and everybody. And, finally there's a plane assigned to the press, and we're all on the plane going to Dallas. And on the plane, the pilot announces that it's just been announced that JFK, has passed in the hospital. And I don't even remember, at this young age I am at now, how I got from the airport to the Dallas police station. But everybody on that plane got there. And just as we got there, I would say within 15 minutes, there were no press passes in those days. There was no live television coverage. There was one local television camera on a big tripod at the end of the hallway where Captain Fritz's office was.
Will Fritz.
Yeah, Will Fritz. And just as we get there, and I always was working in hallways, not to use long lenses, with my Leicas. Just as I get there, Oswald comes out of the elevator for the first time. You see, he had been captured almost 3.5, 4 hours later because, he had left the depository, had actually killed Officer Tibbet, and then was eventually arrested. And in those 3.5, 4 hours, it only took 2 hours and 56 minutes for the jet to go from LA to Dallas. And what struck me as I took that picture, and many others, how young he was. He wasn't much younger or older than me. It was like looking at somebody my own age. And I always thought of assassinations as somebody mature, that, kills somebody important and this and that. And that's the first time that I was faced with somebody almost my own age that could do irreparable harm in some ways. And
literally changed
and that's
history.
the emotion that I had probably within 30 minutes after. I couldn't believe He was almost my same age. And of course, in the years later, we'll talk about Marina and so forth.
Yeah.
But that's my first image. And that is, of course, Marina with the baby and Margaret Oswald taken when she was, taken to Fritz's office.
That was baby June, right?
Yeah,
June
right,
was,
yeah. And, years later, Mailer and I did a book that when June was grown up, she didn't like very much. And she wrote us a letter, but, that picture of her,
And there's this chaos in the police headquarters,
Oh,
right?
yeah, but you see, there was no press passes at that time, and, all the Texas Rangers there, and it was just chaos, there were no video cameras. It was Eclair 16 millimeters or Bell and Howell IMOs with triple lenses on the front, wide angle telephone, you flip it around. Those were really the days of emerging, and that live coverage from was the first time the nation saw live coverage of a tragic event in the making, taking place.
Yeah.
Up to that time, there is no record of live coverage. And that one camera at the end of the hallway was broadcasting live.
And you took this photograph. Right?
Oh, yeah, this is one of many. I was there 3 days. But interesting thing is, what's really important to me is not only the work I did there, but, where did Ruby and this person live and that person live? And I remember going up and to where the police officers had their locker rooms, and they were still on shifts, and I hired an off-duty policeman to drive for me in Dallas, and that's how I got around, because you go into a city that you're completely lost. And how did I come up with that idea? Because Parry Match had taught me years earlier that when you go into a strange town, you hire a taxi cab driver. Forget about renting a car. Hire a taxi cab driver. So that was...
And trying to figure out where you're going.
Yeah, So,
We've got a photograph, of course, a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph by Bob Jackson.
Bob Jackson, yeah, of course.
Tell us about, you've got a personal story about that photograph.
Well, you see, this was 2 days after Oswald was captured, and in the basement, they were moving Oswald from there, from the police station to jail. And I was to the left with, like everybody else. And when this additional tragedy was unfolding, and Ruby came down and so forth, I saw the flash go off, but I was blocked. I didn't even get a picture. I've got some pictures of Oswald on the ground going into the ambulance, but the key picture, and I saw embedded in my mind this image because the flash had gone off. And there was a second flash, too, from a higher angle. And I realized that it was that photographer. And I followed him to the newspaper. I was working for the...
I think it was Dallas Times Herald. Yeah.
And I followed him. I was working for the Saturday Evening Post under contract. And this first print came right out of the darkroom. It was cropped like this, not the full negative. And they immediately took it to the drum and they put it on and they sent it worldwide over wire photo. And when they brought it back from the drum, standing there, I said, I want to buy the magazine rights to that picture worldwide, because I was working for the Saturday Evening Post. And the guy said, what do you mean? I said, well, AP's just released it newspaper-wise. Who owns the magazine rights? He says, well, I guess I'll find out. And he comes back, he says, we still do. And I took out my checkbook. In those days, I had a little checkbook. And I said, I'll give you $10,000 for the magazine rights. And he went and spoke to somebody else and came back. And I wrote a check for $10,000. And I turned over the print. And it had a timestamp on the back of November 22nd. Well, that picture wasn't taken on November 22nd, taken on the 24th. They hadn't changed the timestamp in the darkroom for 2 days because everything in Dallas had gone crazy. And in my handwriting, I copyrighted the picture to Bob Jackson. And it wasn't until a year later, and I walked out of there with the print and took it to the airport and gave it to a stewardess and said, hand carry this. I don't remember if I gave her 50 or 100 or whatever. And that's how the print got
Did
back.
somebody say something about Wheeler Dealer a minute ago?
That's right.
So-
Well, that comes from my father being a salesman, you see. I was raised with my father being a salesman, and I think I'm responsible for that.
So we have that photograph now, right?
Yeah,
in
in
the
the
archives.
archives, yeah.
So
Yeah.
so Evan, go to the next one for us here. This are two movie stars you probably recognize, Paul Newman and Robert Redford.
Yeah.
But you probably see them in a little different way than what
Yeah.
you may have in the
Well,
past.
I-
Tell us what's going on
I'd
here.
photographed four, this was the fifth movie that I photographed Paul Newman on. He and I got along very, very well, and he enjoyed the way I photographed him. I did Cool Hand Luke, I did From the Terrace with his wife, various things. And this was a film in Mexico called Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
You may have heard it.
And Connie Hall was a great cinematographer, and he decided he wanted to shoot the entire movie backlit, okay, for those that understand photography. So sometimes it would take an hour for the sun to be in the right place, and George Roy Hill would go crazy, and we'd have to wait for the lighting to be right for Connie Hall. And so they had ping pong tables, and they had these portable saunas that Newman would get in to sweat out the beer that he'd drink at night. And so they were always playing ping pong. And this is a picture with the assistant director on the left and George Roy Hill on the right, which is probably one of my most,
Well, who is the one with his back to us in the picture?
the assistant director.
The assistant
Yeah,
director,
right.
okay.
But what's interesting is about a day after I made this picture, I hadn't even developed the film yet, I said to Paul, I'm getting tired of photographing different heads on the same bodies. And he says, Larry, come on, stop taking pictures, start directing films. I said, Paul, nobody is going to give me a chance to direct a film. I'm just a magazine photographer getting paid by the studios. And he throws me the script across the table, and he says, I'm telling John Foreman that you're going to pick a scene. George Roy Hill, he'll be away, and you can direct 3, 4, 5 minutes of the film. So I looked at the script that night or the next day, and there was nothing in there, a scene for me to direct. But there was a mistake in the script. Now, that script had sold for $400,000 by a great screenwriter, and it wasn't like a mistake in the writing, it was a mistake in the continuity of the story. Because in the story, they go from the west to the east, and they get on a boat to go to Bolivia. Half the movie takes place in Bolivia. And I said to Paul, well, in those days, you had to take the train across the country, and then in New York, the boats didn't leave every single week for South America. You had to wait a month. I said, why don't you have a montage of all the things that they had to do in New York, traveling across the country? They had to go see Tiffany's. Maybe there's the Easter Parade. And Newman said, give Schiller a sketch artist. I want to see this. So I sat with the sketch artist and told him about these ideas, and he invented the scenes. And Paul said to John Foreman, the producer, Larry's going to shoot these in stills, and we'll put it together, a montage of his pictures. In the end, well, quite honestly, I still didn't know very much about editing. Maybe I still don't. But I had met Charles Ames in the Seattle World's Fair. And in the American Pavilion, he had these incredible montages done with still photographs. So I called Ames's wife, and I said, who was the editor that did that? And
For the montage.
Yeah, for the montage. And I hired him, and I put together this still montage, and I showed it to Paul, and he showed it to John Foreman, and then they showed it to Burt Bacharach, who wrote a piece of music. And before I know it, it's in the film. And what's interesting is that's what started me to become a motion picture producer and director.
Well, you said at one time, you said that by 1968, Newman was at the peak of his power
Right.
as America's leading man. He was Butch Cassidy's producer as well as its star.
Right, yeah.
And you said, Paul opened a new door for me
Yeah, to direct.
by giving me the chance to direct 5 minutes
Yeah.
at the heart of the film.
Yeah.
I really encourage all of you. That film is obviously very available
Well, yeah.
from streaming, and I encourage you to go see that
It was
again.
interesting to shoot those scenes. You know, they couldn't stop production and they couldn't add. You know, they went to Dick Zanuck, who was running the studio for his father at that time, and the budget to shoot that montage, the scenes, was $250,000, I remember. They had to borrow from Streisand the Hello Dolly set that she hadn't shot in yet. They had to get permission from her. And we shot it between Christmas and New Year's. The 5 days, Redford came back from skiing, and if you look at the montage carefully, you could see, you never see his right leg, because he had broken his leg skiing and he was in a cast.
Now
But-
you have a little insight
Yeah.
looking at the
Montage.
Where
But-
is his right leg? Watch
Yeah,
for his right.
yeah. But after that, Bob Evans at Paramount saw it, and Berry Gordy called me and said, do some montages for Lady Sings the Blues. I have to collapse the film. Well, that was 1.5 years' work. And after that, my chutzpah just took me into producing and directing films.
Okay, let's look at the next one, the next slide. And this is another
Right.
a big project for you, and that's the Executioner's Song. Tell us about that.
Well, I was in Encino, and one day I pick up the LA Times, and I see an article about a convict in Utah who had killed somebody, and he had attempted suicide and convinced his girlfriend to attempt suicide at the same time. And they found at the foot of her bed her children that were under 2 years of age. She hadn't even taken the children to her mother or a relative or a neighbor, but had taken the pills that she had gotten for her in Gilmore.
That was
And
Nicole, right?
That was Nicole. And I said to myself, and this, is this the definition of evil? I remember saying that. This con convincing a girl to do that, to leave her children. And within 3 hours, I was on a plane, and it took me over 1.5 years to interview 157 people that had to do with that entire story. I broke into prison to interview Gilmore. I witnessed his execution. And, then
Let's see the next photograph, because
Yeah.
there we go, that's Gilmore.
that's Gilmore about an hour before he was executed in Captain Fritz's office.
Well, not Captain Fritz.
No,
Yeah.
excuse me,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
But this is an hour before he was executed.
Warden Smith's office.
Yeah.
I get names mixed up, but about an hour before. And, being dyslexic, I knew by then I had already done projects. I couldn't write. So originally, I was going to have a friend write the book, Barry Farrell, a very fine writer. And then I was going to have Joan Didion write it. But then I realized that Norman Mailer had stabbed his wife 3 times, and at a knee-jerk reaction, like Gilmore had killed these 2 young Mormon missionaries when he was chasing his girlfriend that she had left him. So I sent the interviews that I had done to Mailer to read. And Mailer called me up and he said to me, you asked them what was on the walls of their grandfather's house? I said, yeah, that's texture.
You sent him the questions.
The questions in
Yeah.
my interviews.
Yeah.
And then he says, and you asked somebody else whether it was raining that day or what the color of their socks were or what they were wearing? I said, yeah, that's all texture that you need. He says, I'm writing the book. And that's how Norman, he and I had already done 2 books together, but and it took
You'd
him.
already done the Maryland book, right?
And Faith of Graffiti.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Graffiti book.
Yeah, and it took him 1.5 years to get through my interviews, and then he ran out of money, and he had to go take a life insurance, a medical test, so I could get more life insurance on him, so that the publisher would give us more money. They wouldn't do it unless we had more life insurance. But those are the business things that you have to go through too to make a project work. And Mailer wrote the book based on my interviews. And, you know, every word in the book is his words, and he figured out how to do it. And
Yeah, but I want to emphasize, he didn't have anything to write about without your stuff.
that's true.
You know.
Yeah, he did make some phone calls, and he did play chess with Nicole, the girlfriend. We brought her to New York so Norman could feel the texture as the flesh, as we say. And, you know, sometimes you do have to feel somebody.
Well, didn't you also take Nicole and her kids
Right.
to California?
I took them right out of Utah with her mother to Malibu, got them, rented a house in Malibu.
You rented the house for them?
Oh, yeah, and they were 6 months there, and went to a psychologist and asked, how do you deal with somebody that had attempted suicide? And, you know, I had taken her out of the hospital and brought her with the lawyers and the state's permission, since I agreed to have certain medical supervision for her. And, you know, that was all part of how do you keep the elements honestly together, because I knew I had to interview her. And at one point, you know, I even moved her into my house for a couple days to interview her, you know. So, you know, people were always coming in and out of my house for interviews.
I have to tell you, you know, the really getting all of these recordings, as I said
Yeah.
earlier, we're talking about hundreds of hours, not just of this whole thing with Gilmore and his family, but everything else that Larry's done. We talked about this at lunch today.
Yeah.
You know, all these interviews are done. I've done quite a bit of oral history, not that much, but anyway, not as much as you. But the fact is, we collect this material because maybe just some quotes come out of one interview and it goes into the book, yet there's all this other stuff that's untapped, that's sitting there for research and teaching. And that's what thrills, of course, me
Well,
as a historian.
yeah.
That's really,
Well, my motivation, you know, when I heard about the Briscoe Center, because I heard about them after, you know, we put mailers archives at the Harry Ransom Center, which was maybe the wrong thing to do. But nevertheless, to me, I was interested in journalism students that might be interested to see the process, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it, the wrong, the mistakes that were made or whatever. And so everything I've ever done to kind of motivate my work or somebody else's work here is only for education, you know? And that to me, you know, I learned, you know, in the street, and I learned, you know, even though I didn't read, you know, perusing magazines and so forth. So education to me is the most important thing, and I'm still learning every single day. I get up, I still get the New York Times on paper every single day, and, you know, I peruse it and read it, and once in a while I find an article that I read through. But I still, you know, and I get all my grandchildren's get the Junior This Week magazine, which is really an important publication for young kids to see how a story is reported all over the world. You know.
well, I mean, what you've done is just cover such a wide range of
Yeah.
things. I mean, I think you can tell from what we've just been
Yeah.
talking about here. If you were looking at which I hope you were,
Yeah.
looking at the photographs that we were kind of rotating as you were here, and as I was talking, you may have seen a photograph of Larry with Tommy Lee Jones
Yeah,
on the
sure.
set, for example.
Yeah.
Of course, a native Texan, Tommy
But I've
Lee.
been highly criticized. You all should know about what I do because, you know, sometimes you have to use money to get exclusivity, but exclusivity doesn't necessarily give you the truth. You still have to search out the facts and know how to interview or how to do it. So, you know, it isn't as if I've had a free ride. You know, I've had articles written, you know, criticizing the fact that, well, with Gilmore, you know, I went to his uncle and, you know, and offered a certain amount of money to buy the rights. And I've done that with other stories. You know, again, maybe it deals partly with my insecurity because of dyslexia, partly because, you know, I want the exclusive time to do things, not to rush it, you know. And many of my projects take months and years. But you see, not working for a media organization, nobody's going to tell me, oh, you got a deadline tomorrow or this or that. You when I said to Norman one day, we've got to go to Belarus. And the
Yeah, let's
Soviet
see
Union.
let's see the next
Yeah.
Slide. This is you and Norman.
And that's the
Belarus.
president of Belarus, and that's my translator I brought from the United States, and that's the president's secretary on the left. And we spent 9 months in Belarus. We hired an ex-Mossad agent who told us where most of the people immigrated into South America, even into Chicago, people that knew Oswald, so we would be able to go and interview them. And we spent 9 months interviewing people.
Oh, well, let me say, Larry, if you
Yeah.
could, at this point, what was this about? What was this project about?
This was about Oswald's years in the Soviet Union prior to him coming back and tragically,
But it was
killing
for,
Kennedy.
but it was for his book, Oswald's Tale.
Oswald's Tale, which was an idea I came
Yeah.
up with. I said, Norman, we've got to do a book on the mystery years of Oswald, and we got to get the files. And Ed Epstein helped me get a little bit of the CIA files, or the Secret Service files, but I really wanted the KGB files.
This is the KGB files.
Because, we knew that Oswald had been moved from Moscow to Minsk, and, who were all the girls that he met, and this and that, and everything else. So we just moved there, Norman and I, and as an example, at that time, Yeltsin hadn't given Clinton yet the KGB
Well, they don't know
files.
this yet, but let me ask you this,
yeah.
though. How did you get these things? I mean, out of the secret police.
Well-
This is the secret police files of the Soviet Union.
Well, yeah. Well,
Okay.
number one, I had a very good translator who when we walked up in Belarus to the KGB offices, which were in a building, a step, and the secretary to Strakowski, who was the head of the KGB, Jesus, at 88, I still remember some of these names, was coming down the steps, and Lyudmila Peresvetova, she goes up to meet him, and she falls down on purpose so that the secretary would have to lean over. She was very, very smart, and help her up, and so forth. And so we became, very, very friendly, and Strakowski's secretary said, oh, hire this guy from the Mossad, hire this translator, and hire this. And we would go knock on doors and so forth, and if the people weren't home, we'd leave a note saying the American Tolstoy was here. But the way we got people to talk was to buy food on the black market for them in Belarus, and so they could cook, and we'd have lunches and dinners. We never interviewed anybody unless it was over a meal. And that was the way we really got people to talk about it and everything. And then another translator we used, and the ambassador was there, and there's a lot of war stories.
But how did you get this?
Well, if you really want to know the truth,
I do. We want to know the truth.
$25,000 to the right hands. That's the truth.
Are
The
you
truth.
telling us, well, let's back
That's
off.
the truth.
All right, let's back off a second.
You want the truth.
Are you telling us that the KGB chief was corrupt?
No, his secretary was.
Oh, his secretary.
Strakowski, I never discussed anything with Strakowski except Oswald. And, but, I remember you could only bring $10,000 per trip in those days. Maybe still that's, out into a foreign country in dollars. So Norman went out one airport, Lyudmila went another, and I went another, and each of us brought back part of $25,000 in $100 bills, because, to make the $25,000. And quite honestly, you want the truth, not the truth.
We do want the
It
truth.
was $25,000 in the secretary's hands, and one day they deliver this to me, and I say, well, I need at least 3 copies. And they said, well, what do you mean 3 copies? I said, well, I don't know if we're being set up that when we take it out of the country, in those days, they looked at everything not coming in but going out, because, they didn't want you stealing religious icons and things like that. And I said, Lyudmila's going to leave one airport, Norman will leave another, I'll leave another one. And we need 3 copies. And so I sent my driver, we had a driver from Germany, to Vienna from Belarus to bring back paper for the Xeroxing of it. And then in the middle of the night, I get a phone call from Schukowski's secretary saying, I need toner. They're going to notice the toner's missing. So we had to send the driver back to Vienna to bring toner. And it was the old type of machines, where you had the bags of toner. So we had 3 copies.
Yeah, and this is, let me put this in a little context. I mean, you guys are working on this book, Oswald's Tale.
Yeah.
And, but this is also post-communist, pre-Putin. So it's a kind
Correct.
of Wild West period
It's
in
Gorbachev's
Russia.
period, just
Yeah.
over,
So, I mean,
yeah.
but you got it out of the country, obviously,
Yeah, I got
and we
it out.
have it now.
Yes,
Now tell about
you got
Yeltsin.
the set that I was given,
Tell the story about Yeltsin and Clinton.
Well, it's there's a lot of stories that, deal with President Clinton and so forth. So I have this maybe a year or 2 years, and the original I have in my house on Elville Drive up here off of Winnetka. And one day about 6:30 in the morning, I knock on the door. I open the door. We're from Secret Service. Shows me this. Yes, sure. President Yeltsin has just given President Clinton the files on Lee Harvey Oswald. And we'd like to compare what we were given with what you have. And for 2 days, I never went into the dining room. I had 2 lawyers there sitting on one side of the table, and they were on the other. And I don't know if there's any differences or not, but they wanted to compare what they were given, whatever. Now, I think they got probably more of the files, but they compared what we had. We had a couple hundred pages.
And you got English translation, too.
Yeah.
That
Well,
came with it for our archives.
that's correct. The English translations, we brought 2 translators to Belarus that I'm trying to remember what university gave us the Russian students to do that.
Oh, to do the translations?
Yeah, we had it done there in the hotel in Belarus. Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at the next slide. There we go. And there you are on the beach.
With O.J.
Is that
Well,
California, obviously?
You see, this is real interesting because in college, I photographed O.J. Simpson when he was running for SC, and I made a very, very historic picture of him breaking that record against UCLA, the rushing or the whatever record it was.
Number of yards, yeah.
Yeah, the number of yards. And then when I moved up on Elville Drive, O.J. with his first wife lived diagonally across the street. I never saw him really, but one day my daughter comes into the house and her hand's bleeding. And I said, what happened? And it was Sunday, and she says, well, he threw a long one and I missed it and I fell in the street and cut my hand. I said, what do you mean you threw? She said, well, every Sunday O.J. goes and throws passes to the kids on the street. So that's why the second time I met O.J., because my daughter would wind up babysitting for him and Margaret, his first wife. And then, by pure coincidence, I become friendly with Robert Kardashian. We actually go into business doing some things, music tunes. And, his wife is turning, I think it was 35, and he asked me to make a music video, And of course, O.J. was a friend of Kardashian, and I didn't know that. So I see O.J. again, and put him in the music video in his office. So what happens is when this other tragedy takes place, the murders, Robert calls me in the middle of the night, and he says, the police are going to come out here, and I don't know how to handle them and so forth. And I said, because he lived in Royal Oaks, I said, meet me by the 405 freeway on Sepulveda, halfway down the ramp. I said, why halfway? I said, well, if the police have parabolic microphones, they're not going to be able, with all the traffic, to pick up what we say. So I had a conversation with Kardashian, and he asked me to be kind of his unofficial advisor on how to handle the press. And I had remembered something from years before that later Robert Shapiro would quote many times. I said to Robert, don't say no comment, because that's a comment. And, you know, so I was in the house, and when O.J. was hiding out before the chase and all of that, the white Bronco. And, you know, I helped with various things, giving them advice, good and bad, and so forth. I made some big mistakes, and like we all do. But then, like a month and a half later, Robert calls me up, and he says, because, you know, O.J. was in one of his bedrooms with Paula Barbieri, and he says, you know, we finally opened one of the drawers to the dressers, and we found this my tape recorder, which was missing for all these months. See, O.J. had taken the tape recorder and had taped his version of what took place, which was discovered months after. So,
Well, we have another document too.
that's the handwritten note that O.J. left that we found
This is also in the archive.
in the archive and so forth. But, you know, what happened with O.J. is that O.J. had no money, cash. He owned condos, he owned this. All his money was tied up in pension plans. And, you know, he had a very good business advisor, but he had no cash. And they needed money, so I saw all these letters that were going to O.J. in jail, thousands of letters, bags of them. And I said to Robert, how much money does Shapiro need? He says he needs $1.5 million to get Henry Lee and this and that and so forth. And I said, well, your $1.5 million is laying in those letters. I said, well, what do you mean? He says there are maybe $10 bills, maybe there's Bibles in some of them, maybe there's a knife. I said, no, we're gonna take all those letters, we're gonna organize them by subject index, and which I hired a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, Bob Johnson, to do. He was with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and he flew to LA. And we organized them, and then I went in to jail, and I interviewed O.J. for, 16 visits, in which we put it together and then published a book, which we got the money to pay for.
That's American Tragedy, right?
No,
No.
that was I Want to Tell You.
Oh, that's the one I want to tell you.
I Want to
That's
Tell
right.
You, which was
Yeah.
published and released before the jury was sequestered.
Yeah, okay.
That was a condition that all the lawyers and we all agreed upon. But that's how the money was first.
But all those letters that you're talking about are also in the
Oh,
archive.
that's right. They're all in the
I
archive.
mean, it's a
Yeah.
treasure trove for anyone wanting to
Yeah.
really understand public reaction and give us their opinion
Yeah.
as to his guilt or innocence.
I collected everything on every story I ever did. Some things I accidentally, moved too fast, but I tried to just throw in boxes. In my first house on Elville here in LA, all the boxes were up in the attic, and I had to put air conditioning units in the attic and to pull the hot air out from the summer, And eventually, we became more organized with databases.
And now it's
Yeah.
even more organized.
That's right, that's right,
We're
yeah.
working on it, getting it organized. I
Yeah,
have
we had
some staff here that are
800,
working on it.
800 boxes, we had something like that.
800 boxes,
That came here.
I think my staff counted every single one of them as they came in the door. During the summer.
Well, Colin, my assistant and archivist, he helped put it all together to get it here properly, so at least we weren't
Well, we're
too much.
running out of time
Yeah,
here
so-
a little bit. I want to mention something else
Sure.
before we. I'm going
there's
to
Nixon.
ask you. Yeah, this is of course these are this is the Nixons, Pat Nixon,
Yeah.
and Richard Nixon. And tell us about this picture though.
Well, this is taken at the Ambassador Hotel, the night he concedes at 3 o'clock in the morning to JFK. I had covered his entire campaign for Paris Match, the French magazine. And I was in front shooting, again, with my Nikon and my 180, and got that picture, which eventually won Picture of the Year award, best storytelling picture of that year, the National Press Photographers Association. I didn't follow him back into the kitchen where Harry Benson photographed the tragedy that took place.
Well, you're
a
talking
few
about
minutes.
Kennedy now.
That's right.
This is Nixon.
Oh,
yeah.
right, I
Yeah.
got off. So this is at the same podium as Bobby Kennedy spoke in the Ambassador Hotel The same podium, the
8
same
years later.
8 years later. No difference except the background, you know.
One of the reasons, first of all, I thought it'd be a timely picture. Anyway, the concession
I get
speech.
things mixed up.
But I also wanted to on here, because let's see the next slide, because I want to explain something
Yeah.
about how the Briscoe Center operates and
Sure.
what we're doing. We've built this 10 million image archive, one of the largest of any university in the country, photojournalists and documentary photographers. And we're not a museum, we're a research center, we're a history research center. And we do have and I hope you go look at the exhibits that we have, but we're not a museum. And what we do is we don't collect, let's say, like most museums, collect 10 prints or something, you know, that we want in the collection, that a curator, you know, picks. We want everything. We want everything that Larry's done. We want everything that the photographer's done. This is the contact sheets for that Pat
Picture.
Nixon, Richard Nixon
Yeah.
moment. Now, so instead of just taking the print and putting it in the collection, okay, we got a nice print of Pat and Richard Nixon. The contact sheet shows, you know, before and after. In other words, that print is somewhere coming out of the middle of this contact sheet.
Right, yeah.
There's not a lot difference here in this contact sheets, but there's a lot of contact sheets show, for example, we have a photograph of the night that Ali defeated Sonny Liston in Miami, and they made a movie, One Night in Miami, which you may have seen. And there's a scene recreated in that movie that the director recreated of Bob Gomel's photograph.
Right.
Where they're celebrating Ali's victory. Malcolm X is
taking
there.
pictures.
And Malcolm X is a very famous photograph now. Malcolm X is standing back behind the bar,
Yeah.
and of course Ali is mugging for him, and he's taking photographs of Ali. Malcolm X. Okay, well Bob is still living, and we have his entire archive. When I saw that movie, I realized that we had to have the contact sheets for that shoot. That when he was doing that.
Yeah, sure.
And sure enough, we did. And so the great thing about it is it shows what happened before Malcolm was taking the pictures of Ali and what happened after. There is a visual narrative that these contact sheets, whereas the photographer or whoever publishes the image, they just want one image, let's say, and they publish it.
Yeah.
So a lot of photographers don't understand when I approach them, that they'll go, oh gosh, you know, I got probably 20 or 25 prints that you might want. No. We want everything. Right. We even want your bad photographs, okay? And the reason for that is because of the strong feeling that I feel strongly about this. Photographs can be read like diaries and letters, not all photographs. But they have elements of information in them that historians need to use, and they do. So even if it's a bad photograph, okay, and when I say bad, I mean maybe not framed properly, blurred or something like that, even bad photographs can be useful for historical research or be important. For example, when Bob Gomel took that photograph of Malcolm taking photographs of Ali, he didn't know who Malcolm was.
Right.
And he didn't even realize he had photographs of Malcolm, because he had, you know, he wasn't really Malcolm X at that point. And so, give you another example, we have the archive of Dirk Halstead, a longtime photographer for Time magazine. And when we acquired his archive, it was hundreds of thousands of photographs and contact sheets and color transparencies, which are also in your collection. And when the Monica Lewinsky Clinton scandal broke, Dirk called me up. He was going to throw away all of these color transparencies that he just thought were grip and grin photographs. And he called me up when this Monica Lewinsky thing broke, and he said, you know, I know that, I've seen that woman somewhere. And sure enough, make a long story short, he had a photograph in the color transparency slide of Monica hugging Clinton in the Rose Garden and looking up at Dirk. And that made the Time magazine cover.
Yeah.
But the point is he was going to throw that away. It was just another grip and grin, in this way, a real grip, They were hugging. You know, it was just another moment for him at the White House.
Yeah, well, in the early days, I used to throw away all my rejects.
God, that makes me sick.
Yeah. And I have some really interesting pictures. It was easier to throw away the color transparencies than the black and white.
Well, I
you
was
know.
sitting at Dirk's place in Georgetown, and he had put all of his stuff together in
Yeah.
boxes, and he said, okay, this is, I got all my stuff here now. And I looked over and I saw these boxes over here in the corner. I said, well, this includes this. He, no, that's my crap. You don't want
Yeah.
that. Well, that's where Monica was. Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
I want to, let's see, I think we've got a couple of minutes for a couple of questions. Yes.
I had the pleasure of working with both Larry and Norman back years ago when I was working for the FBI in charge of all the JFK records. And I gotta say, they never showed up to me with truckloads of cash or checkbooks. But I want Larry to tell the all-time great story, and it's one of the greatest coups in American history. And first off, I have to say, as a professional historian, he's the best.
Well,
He's the shop vac of, I mean, he makes Home Depot shop vacs look, they pale in comparison. Because literally when Larry shows up on a scene, you want to make sure that you have everything, because he's resourceful as hell. He's got more energy than the Energizer Bunny, and he just collects everything. And I mean, having spent a career with the FBI, and he doesn't throw it away. And so I say he's the absolute best. But one of his greatest feats of all time was going to Parkland Hospital with Earl Ruby, obtaining, and I'll let you tell the story, the deathbed confession of Jack Ruby. Why don't you tell the story?
Number one, when Jack Ruby, took the life of Oswald, and he was taken off, and I knew, who are the members of his family, and it was the Rubenstein family, and I was introduced to Earl Ruby straight away, his brother, and I knew that, his brother would be allowed to see him all the time when other people wouldn't, that they would never deny a family member to see him, and within, and you have it in your archives, within 48 hours, I bring in a writer from California who I worked with, and while Jack is the second day he's in jail, we obtain his life rights because I was able to give some financing to his mother and his family. So my connection with the Rubenstein family goes on and on and on. And then one day I get a phone call from Earl, and he says, Jack's in the hospital and he's going to die. And he doesn't want to die owing the IRS money. That was a strange phone call. How much does he owe the IRS? And I don't remember the figure exactly, but it's in my memoirs. It was either $16,000 or $21,000 or whatever, and which was a lot of money in those days. He says he doesn't want to owe any, so we can arrange, an interview if you can make sure he doesn't die owing the IRS any money. Well, Elmer Gertz was his attorney at that time out of Chicago, and I'd met Elmer Gertz earlier on some other thing. So we decided we needed to do the last interview with him, and there were some questions about, where he parked his car when he went down the ramp, and this and that and everything else. And I realized that the tape recording equipment was too heavy to bring into the hospital room or sneak it in, and so forth. So I don't remember if I went down or if I sent an assistant down, but we went to Neiman Marcus and bought one of those recorders that's hidden in a briefcase, right off the shelf, right off the shelf, and took it back, and with Elmer Gertz and his attorney and Joe Tonnahill from Jasper, and so forth, we had these series of questions, and of course there was Texas Marshals in the hospital room, so we had the questions written out in Yiddish, so that would be spoken to him in Yiddish, and he would respond in Yiddish. and so that's how the last interview was technically done, and then we had translators translate it. So the original tapes, there's some English on it because Elmer Gertz tells Jack and so forth. But then the conversation is all in Yiddish.
Another question, and we're going to go ahead. Yeah, Doug?
Hey, Larry. What do you think with Trump winning and with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., that deal they've made, that the JFK assassination records, whatever's been left in the government may come out early? Are you eyeing what that is, and do you think there's much of significance in that, or has it been redacted?
Well, nobody knows what's, left accidentally on purpose in some filing cabinet. But, we obtained a lot of material, Norman and I. I only met Bobby Kennedy Jr. once, and I think there'll be some shenanigans, but I think it's a way off. And the question is, the media, and there's a different type of scrutiny now, than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I think people are going to be careful, but whether there's something still laying there, I don't know. I know that Ed Epstein, a writer who passed on not too long ago, he obtained a lot of stuff. And I interviewed a lot of people that were involved, and Norman and I did, either separately or jointly. But I think we know pretty much everything about Oswald at this point.
Well, before we close, let me say this. Larry has a photo show that's going to open at the Modern Rocks Gallery in East Austin. It's at 916 Springdale Road, Building 3. It's a gallery. What is the guy's name that is
Jeffrey
Walker? Is his
Walker,
Steve,
yeah.
Steve
Yeah.
Walker,
Yeah.
who owns it, and who was in the
Yeah.
band, what was it, Modern English?
Yeah.
Yeah, and at any rate, so it's, what, 6 o'clock tomorrow?
Yeah.
And it's going to open at
There's
6
about
o'clock
30
tomorrow.
interesting prints. There's a couple interesting things from the assassination. Oswald's gun, an iconic image that I made that's in the exhibit, I think.
Well, I want to invite everyone, if they
Yeah.
can come to tomorrow night,
Yeah.
to Modern Rocks Gallery over on Springdale Road. And then I also want to heartily thank Larry Schiller for working with us and making this all possible with this incredible treasure trove of history. It's just totally unique in so many ways. I mean, thank you, Ferris. I mean, there are so many things, and Doug, that we couldn't even talk about tonight. I mean, this is just a little part of all of this. So please join me in thanking Larry for working with the Briscoe Center.